Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, episode 24. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Fellow at the America First Policy Institute and Chair of the China Policy Initiative. A reminder to our audience, for whom we are most grateful, viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all our interviews on Apple, Google, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. You can always access our podcasts at thefederalnewswire.com. My guests today are the Chair and Vice Chair of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. Commission Chair Carolyn Bartholomew served as longtime counsel, legislative director, and chief of staff to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. She was a professional staff member on the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and also served as a legislative assistant to U.S. Representative Bill Richardson. She has previously served as the Commission's chairman for 5 reporting cycles and served as vice chairman for 6 report cycles. She was reappointed to the Commission in 2021, for the term expiring in December of 2023. Commission Vice Chair Alex Wong is Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute. Mr. Wong most recently served as Deputy Special Representative for North Korea and Deputy Assistant Secretary for North Korea at the U.S. Department of State. In that position, he was the number 2 negotiator in denuclearization talks with North Korea and guided the U.S.-led international pressure campaign. Vice Chairman Wong was reappointed to the Commission in 2021 for his term that expires in December of 2023 as well. To Carolyn and Alex, we welcome you to the China Desk. Let's jump in. Now, with Carolyn and Alex, I usually try to talk with each guest a little bit about their personal backgrounds, about what brought them into this subject matter, so our audience has a sense for why you ended up doing what you're doing. So before we talk about the commission itself, Carolyn, how about we start with you? Did you, just when you got that third grade question from a teacher, said, what do you want to do when you grow up? You said, I want to be the chair and vice chair for a congressionally mandated commission that focuses on China?
Absolutely not. And I want to use this as an example for young people who are starting their careers about the serendipity that can define a career. I was not a China expert. I was working on Capitol Hill on a bunch of foreign policy issues, she was not speaker yet, Ms. Pelosi, on June 4th, 1989, when the Tiananmen Square massacre happened, which shifted a lot of the focus of our office onto issues related to China. During the 1990s, the issues we put together a coalition everywhere from the Family Research Council to the AFL-CIO and focused on human rights, proliferation, and trade. Never in my life would I have thought that I would spend 30 years working on U.S.-China policy, but it's just been fascinating to see how the issues have grown, how the issues have changed, and where we are, and try to figure out how we move forward.
Absolutely. There's so much of that I resonate with, just from a slightly different point of view. But yes, it's been a wild, long journey. But Alex, I assume you did actually say, I wanted to grow up and work on a commission on Capitol Hill focused on China, right?
Well, not quite. I think I wanted to be a second baseman on the Mets growing up. But that dream petered out. I moved into foreign policy. But I think my movement into China policy and broader Indo-Pacific policy kind of matches the movement of the DC foreign policy community to this area. I mean, I began my career in government actually working on Iraq issues. I was working in Baghdad on reconstruction issues. So we were all focused at that time, obviously, on counterterrorism, the Iraq War, Middle East. Everyone was studying Arabic. But as I moved beyond that, in the private sector, on the Hill, in political campaigns and in government, you really saw, and you couldn't ignore it, that the economic, military, political center of gravity of the world was moving east and moving to center in and around Beijing. So the focus of our community, our foreign policy community, had to move with it.
Well, there's certainly been this gravitational pull. And one of the things I'd like to draw out as our conversation moves forward is the focus. I mean, we've gone through periods of U.S. Changes in its role in the world, perceptions of the number one challenge. For some of us early on, we kind of thought that the challenge from the Communist Party of China was bigger than some of the others that people were talking about, and we would regret time and resources getting pulled away So especially those of us who maybe studied China or, as Carolyn was alluding to, saw just a transformational event like the Tiananmen Square massacre that has a way of seizing the mind and resetting priorities. It's been a struggle to get the world to focus on China as a preeminent challenge. We've had a little dance with it in the 1990s that I remember very, very well. And there's been some episodes since. But it seems to be something has changed now. And as we get through the conversation, I want to talk a little bit about that. But before we get to that super duper interesting set of topics, I would like each of you to talk a little bit about the commission itself. A lot of people can be forgiven for getting lost in the Capitol Hill weeds. They know that there are leadership positions and there are committee chairs and ranking members, and there are members that do things, and there's super important staff that do other kinds of things. What are these commissions, and how does this particular commission fit in a sort of an information cycle that talks, about a select committee on China? There's another congressionally mandated committee that does some work. Give us a little bit of an orientation. And Carolyn, since you have the misfortune of having served on it for
I have the seniority.
how about we start with you about saying why this commission
Yes.
and how have you seen it grow?
Yes, interesting. So the commission was established when Congress was voting to grant China permanent normal trade relations back in 2001. The PNTR vote was essential in order for China to join the World Trade Organization. And there was concern, obviously, some concern on the Hill about China's human rights practices, and also what are the national security issues related to the U.S.-China economic relationship. So Congress set up two commissions to deal with these issues. The Congressional Executive Commission on China, the CECC, focuses on human rights issues. Ours, the USCC, focuses on the national security implications of the U.S.-China economic relationship. There are 12 commissioners on our commission, 6 Democrats, 6 Republicans. We are proudly bipartisan. And Steve, you mentioned that these issues have been bipartisan, which has been enormously helpful in trying to meet the challenges. 3 each of us appointed by the House and Senate Democratic and Republican leadership. We serve for 2-year terms. Alex, should I turn it over to you to talk about how we fit into the bigger picture now? And then I do have an observation about how the debate has changed, the policy views have changed, and how the commission has dealt with that.
Yeah, just to jump in there, the 20-year history of the commission, we have seen it change. I think Carolyn will agree that the commission probably was a lonelier voice, not the only voice, but a lonelier voice in analyzing very rigorously China's strategy and competitive stance toward the United States and globally. I think DC and the wider world has come around to that opinion. So the space now is a little bit more crowded. You had mentioned that there is now a committee on the CCP led by our friend and Mike Gallagher, very ably. So there's a lot more attention on the China issue. And I think that's a good thing, because the nature of the challenge, the breadth of the challenge requires more attention at higher levels from the Hill, from the executive branch, from the think tank world. These are all ideas that need to flow into making good policy. And we work really very well with the committee on the CCP in particular, providing an outsider perspective. We do have a great staff of 20, a lot of them Mandarin speakers and readers and writers, to look at the source material, to take a very methodical look at the deeper strategy of China and make recommendations.
So we have tried over the decades that I have been on this commission to be forward-leaning, to identify issues that we think that the Hill should be paying attention to. As Alex said, as the think tank community in DC has gotten more engaged and more concerned about the challenges that China is presenting, it has become a little bit harder for us to be forward-leaning. But we were some of the first people who were talking about cyber issues. Some of the first people to be talking about the intellectual property theft, some of the first people to be talking about ports, which I noticed that the Washington Post, I think, just did a big piece on the strategic challenge of China's acquisition of ports around the world. A little frustrating sometimes. Steve, you can appreciate this. For those of us who've been talking about some of these things for 20 or 30 years, I just keep thinking, if you had only listened to us 20 or 30 years ago, we wouldn't be where we are.
Yeah.
Another observation that I have found particularly interesting is in the early years of the commission. Now, we don't choose who serves on the commission, right? It's the leadership who makes their decisions. So we sometimes have people who come in with national security expertise, sometimes with economic expertise, sometimes with not much expertise on China at all. So as Alex said, we have a really terrific staff. But in the early years, the national security people who were appointed to the commission had a tendency to be what I considered sort of a traditional national security, right? Military strength. And the people with the economics backgrounds had a tendency to be working up, what's going on with the American economy and the impact of China's unfair trade practices on that. What has happened over the years is that those issues have been merging. They have been brought together, particularly when it comes to technology, which has both national security implications for us and economic security implications for us. So that's one of the changes that I've certainly seen.
Well, I think that's a profound one. Another way I think of it is, I think that a lot of these challenges have now onshored. When we go from the 90s into the noughts and into the teens, I think you're quite right about a lot of people, first and foremost, thinking about trade and investment, and those are sort of outside things. And then the military parts had to do with dealing with allies and what are we going to sell or provide or coordinate and integrate and things like that. And there was a bit of a classical war college feel to the subject matter. Not saying that was right or wrong. It's just kind of the times. But today we have, when we're talking about the economic challenge, we have some CCP-tied entities that are looking to buy land, buy businesses, influence universities, influence companies, media companies, a whole range of things. When it comes to things like the pharmaceuticals, we had the COVID experience, but we now also have the fentanyl experience on top of it. And these challenges of the dependence and overconcentration, the consequences of that are now onshored. And I think many more families, it's way beyond the expert community in terms of feeling where this is coming from. So at least for me, I never claimed perfection in terms of what my analysis was. I'm one of those that listened to my professors, watched what I watched, and I felt like I was mugged by reality along the way. And I said, I will never judge anyone for being wrong at one point. I will judge them if they stubbornly hold on to that wrong observation and refuse the evidence. That's to me the greater sin. So
Steve, I think you make a really good point there. I mean, a lot of people like to talk about this competition with China in Cold War terms, comparing it to the Soviet Union. But I think it's different. It's a different type of competition. Whereas the Cold War was a competition of systems that essentially were operating in parallel. Not a lot of connectivity economically that the Soviet Union had either with us or our allies and partners. You look at the strategy, the grand strategy of Beijing, and their strategy is dependent on not working in parallel to the international system, but an abuse and entrenchment in the system of the free world and the liberal order that we have constructed over the past 70 years. So the task and the competition is harder, number one, but has to contain elements not just of outcompeting them, but extruding China from certain systems, whether economically, technologically, politically. And I think a lot of our recommendations in our report and our analysis goes to that aspect or that different kind of nature of this competition.
Carolyn, I agree with all the points both of you guys have made so far. Probably will agree with the points you're yet to make too. But another area that has changed a lot, and I would also consider it onshored, is the human rights issues. When you and all of us were watching the travesty that unfolded in June 4th, 1989, that was happening there. And we might not have ever even really seen it or taken it its full measure if Gorbachev hadn't gone to Beijing and the international press hadn't been there to capture all the demonstrators and all that. But that was over there. Today, we have CCP elements that are chasing down dissidents in the United States. We have CCP elements that are going after Americans who wrong think in the United States and seek to use our own forms of, whether we call it cancel culture or social media pressure or what have you. Their influence operations have really advanced, but also really deeply become a part of American life, whether a lot of Americans know it or not. And when I started watching this stuff in the late 80s and early 90s, I could never have imagined that was ever possible. That has to. So as the commission has looked at this, am I right that the sort of the domestication and the onshoring of a lot of these experiences is one of the big mega trends about how we even try to think about giving policy recommendations? I mean, this was traditionally just foreign policy, but now it's everything policy. It's domestic policy, it's social policy, it's education policy, it's all of it.
Yeah, I think you point out something important, and I want to mention specifically the attacks, the legal attacks, sometimes the physical attacks on dissidents, Chinese dissidents, young Hong Kong people who are here in the United States, who are saying things that the Chinese government doesn't like. And they're working to silence them. And in addition to me being concerned about the Chinese government doing that, there are a lot of other countries that are seeing that the Chinese government is getting away with that, and they are starting to take those actions too, right? Political influence. I can point specifically in Canada, right, to the member of the Canadian Parliament whose family was being threatened because he dared to speak out against some of these things. We've seen this in Australia, where the Chinese government has been trying to influence the political system there. There's a lot of effort to do misinformation and disinformation. There's a lot of material that the Chinese government is using in the United States, the United Front work, in order to silence people who they disagree with, and in order to promote their system of values. And Alex talked a little bit about the Cold War. I think one of the biggest challenges that we have is that the Chinese Communist Party wants to displace liberal democracies and have their own system, authoritarian system. And they are being quite successful, I think, in advancing that kind of model in countries like in Africa and in Latin America. So the challenge for us is great. We have the domestic issues here at home about workers, about fentanyl, about making sure that people have the right to speak freely here in the United States. And then there are these challenges that we are facing with the United States in the world.
Absolutely. Alex, before we turn to the report itself, I think another one of the sort of larger trends that has changed in how we think about the role China plays in the world is, from the Deng Xiaoping era, and then even in what became China's post-Tiananmen Square recovery, we still tended to think about U.S.-China relations as a bilateral relationship and primarily an Asia kind of factor. But today we end up with China having influence over what Russia's options are in dealing with Ukraine. We have China meddling around with peace plans, and I put air quotes around that because it really isn't about peace. And actually, I think picking wrong sides on things that happen in the Middle East. Back when I was cutting my teeth in this area, people would say, oh, well, China's a developing country. It's got to grow up. It doesn't have that huge of an influence. The United States is the hyperpower. I think we now have pretty material evidence that China is playing a significant role, and not necessarily a helpful one, in some key vital regions of the world. And that also, I think, is different than just looking at the classical, what's happening with our alliances in Asia and what's going on with bilateral U.S.-China trade.
No, I think you're very much right. It is not just about our bilateral relationship with China or an idea that I don't think was ever actually true, but this idea that China was just very inward focused on its own development.
Yeah.
And China's very open about this now. Xi Jinping has talked about global security initiative, global development initiative, and I think another one called the Global Civilizational Initiative or project. Along economic security and governance lines, they're trying to expand a global coalition focusing on, I don't like this term, but the global South and other partners that are revisionist in their views of how the world should work. And I would say, when I say revisionist, I specifically mean anti-Western, anti-United States-led global order. So I think this is a very conscious attempt by Xi Jinping to lead this, to fund it, to spread, again, economically, politically, and militarily, its influence in a broad swath of the world. So we have to start thinking about this competition again, not just us in China, and not just regionally in the Indo-Pacific, although the Indo-Pacific is the main realm of this competition, but it is a global competition.
Yeah. So let's turn now to the annual report that the commission puts out. This is something that, as a consumer of the many, many beautiful words that commission reports contain over many years, in some ways, this commission has distinguished itself from in actually driving some news cycles about how the American audience, but increasingly a global audience, is thinking about things. Carolyn, you alluded to some of the sort of sectoral issues over time where the commission had been forward leaning in trying to push policy conversation. Could each of you kind of take a turn framing up what does this year's annual report what is it likely to highlight? We're not going to dive into every nook and cranny of every policy issue, but you guys are very experienced in what are going to be kind of the news cycle driving themes and some of the big baskets of looking at the report this time around.
Yes, thank you, Steve, for that question. It's a broad question. And of course, we're releasing the report on November 14th, basically just as the APEC meeting is getting under control, so is getting underway. So it'll be an interesting time because a lot of the issues that we focus on and we'll be talking about are issues that are going to be being raised or hopefully will be raised in any bilateral meeting between President Biden and General Secretary Xi. I'll focus on two specific buckets of things that we talked about this year. For people who don't know, we do hearings. We usually do 6 or 7 hearings. We work out by consensus the topics that we're going to do. Both some of it is ideas that the staff has, the ideas that the commissioners have, and also ideas that the Hill comes to us with, right? What are the questions that the Hill has? What are they thinking about? How can they are our client. How can we serve them? So one of the trends obviously is the economic deceleration that has been happening inside China and thinking about as the growth in China slows, economic growth slows, what kind of pressure is that putting on Xi Jinping? There's been this whole promise that was made between the CCP and the people of China that they would get economic growth as long as they kept their mouths shut about political reforms. That, I think, also is one of the mistakes that we made in the 1990s, that people somehow thought that economic growth would lead to political reform, and it hasn't. So the deceleration, when we see with the debt crisis that the Chinese government is having, managing, again, economic growth, they have a huge youth unemployment rate. It topped out, I think, at 21% when they then stopped reporting the figures, which means, of course, that it's growing, not that it's getting better. And that's a huge problem for the young people of China. What is their future? Can they believe in their government? And so one of the things that we also focused on is we actually had a hearing on China's education system and some of the educational deficiencies, all of which tied into sort of youth unemployment, youth employability. Are they learning the skills that they need to be learning in order to succeed in a changing economy? There is, of course, a lot of excellence that is taking place in some of the major universities in China, which is where the technological challenges are coming for us. But as somebody characterized it as, there are some pieces of excellence in a sea of mediocrity in the Chinese education system. And we need to be thinking about what does that mean for us competitively, right? Is it going to be the behemoth that people had been saying it was going to be? So those are two of the big issues, I think, the baskets of issues that we talked about. Alex?
Yeah, just stepping back, I think the report tries to take an approach that we are trying to look at the deep animating issues of the US-China competition and China's strategy. And I'll make an analogy here. A lot of the attention from day to day on China policy is on meetings between Xi and Biden, and there will be this APEC meeting. Whether China and the U.S. are in a thaw or a freezing of relations, a lot of just commentary on the diplomatic back and forth. But that's very much like being a beach goer on the shore and trying to understand the character of the ocean by watching the waves in the tidal cycle. It's what we can see; it catches our eye. But in the end, that really isn't representative. What's representative are the jet streams that drive the ocean's character. And so we're looking at trying to analyze and surface for Congress the jet streams that are animating China's strategy. Carolyn has mentioned the economic, kind of structural economic challenges that China is facing, both debt-wise in providing jobs for its youth, the lack of its ability to drive a consumption-led economy, making it fall back on an export-led economy. She's talked about the educational deficits that China's facing. And those are important issues for us to recognize, because long-term, it's going to affect how China makes decisions and then how we make policy in response. But I want to highlight another element of the report, which is looking at China's pursuit, not just as being a fast follower on technology, but really becoming a leader, if not a dominant player in new technologies, whether it's AI, whether it's military systems is really our focus. How are they going to leapfrog the United States, or their attempts to leapfrog the United States in undersea warfare capabilities, in space-based weapons, in nuclear delivery systems, perhaps adding not just having a nuclear triad, but a quad or a four legs of a stool of nuclear attack. And how are they going to apply AI to the battlefield? These are all things that China's looking at, and it's very important for us to understand that and then develop our response policy-wise.
And of course, to make sure that we are doing what we need to do to meet those technological challenges ourselves.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I think each of you has highlighted what I think is one of the overarching problems that we face. We have a challenger, a threat, however you want to name it, who is unencumbered by ethics or accountability. And so when you are dealing with development of artificial intelligence, when you're dealing with dangerous technology, when you're dealing with dangerous biochemical experimentation, and you have no transparency, ethics, or accountability, you unfortunately can sometimes get ahead. And it's the transparent, accountable, and ethical people of the world that take longer to do things because we're trying to be safe and we're trying to make sure they work before they're unleashed on people. And if you have a society that has no definition of true privacy in their society, they can use AI and advanced surveillance technologies to read what people think, do, and say in ways where they probably, with a high degree of accuracy, can predict what's going to happen in a society without actually having to run the experiment. So whether we're talking about space, whether we're talking about public health, or we're talking about military applications of technology, I think we have to ask ourselves, is it even safe to collaborate and participate in research and development and manufacturing with a place like the People's Republic of China? And then second to that, who and how are standards being set that give us a prayer at having rules of the road that will be meaningfully followed or enforced by whom when necessary? And so we hear in our broader culture the discussion about artificial intelligence. Elon Musk is one of those voices that will talk about his knowledge of the field and fear of where that field might go. He's not alone in that, but certainly I think a key thing that we on the China Desk podcast have tried to focus on is how do we preserve the power of setting ethical standards in the international system? How do we kind of give people advice about where can you ethically and safely actually conduct research and manufacturing, and at what point do you get at a danger warning that you can't do that with a government that lied about the origins of COVID, that is delivering fentanyl and isn't really going to be too careful about protecting privacy and individual rights with regard to AI and surveillance. After all, they used that quite nicely in Hong Kong to quash the movement there, and no reason to believe they wouldn't elsewhere. But Carolyn, do you want to take first stab at this scary structural thing? Because I think it really affects everything from human rights to the economic to the national security.
Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot to unpack in what you just said, Steve.
Yeah.
It's just a couple of observations. One is when you talk about transparency and the lack of transparency, in terms of a lot of where the Chinese government is focusing its a technological innovation, they are transparent, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they do these 5-year plans, Made in China 2025. They talk about where they are focusing: biomaterials, nanomaterials, AI, quantum, all of those things, which I think puts an onus on universities here in the US that are doing this cutting edge research, particularly those that are doing cutting edge research with federal funding, to understand who it is they are allowing into their graduate programs, for example, from China, what they're learning and what they might be taking away. On standard setting, what I wanted to mention there is different than the ethical standard setting is the technical standard setting. And we know that the Chinese government is placing its own representatives in technical standard setting bodies all over the place, particularly in the multilateral institutions. And that's an issue economically, because once you get the standard set to what you want it to be, then a lot of other technology flows from there. So there's a challenge that comes with that. I also think you really put your finger on something, which is enforcement. I think we have no choice but to try to work out bilateral and multilateral agreements with some sort of standards. And I say that as somebody who is enormously frustrated with the failure of those agreements, particularly when it comes to Russia and Ukraine. So I find myself questioning, okay, so we have the Geneva Conventions, but what good are they if people aren't abiding by them, and how do we make sure they abide by them? So that I've been thinking about that a lot. I think we have got to engage with the CCP on some of these frameworks of how to do things, but then we have to figure out how to hold them accountable to what they do. So a really interesting example, not in technology, is the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, right? Which they say that they abide by, but then they got a ruling that they didn't like about the Philippines. And so they basically say, well, that doesn't apply to us. So what is the value of doing this? But I don't think that we can give up on trying with that, because what is the alternative?
Yeah, that part does make my head hurt.
Yes. Alex?
Yeah, I mean, just focusing on the technology piece here, and particularly AI that you mentioned, Stephen, I do think we have a research and academic and technology community, as well as a business community, that look, they strive for an ideal of global cooperation, globalized research to advance shared knowledge, and from the business perspective, global investment to achieve gains for shareholders. That might work in a situation where there is a free world and a capitalist led, a U.S. led capitalist system. But when you have, as you say, a non-trusted partner and one that does not actually abide by the rules of that system, it calls into question that level of cooperation. And then it raises the question, well, what steps should the United States and our allies and partners, what should we take in terms of regulating research, prohibiting types of joint research with Chinese institutions, prohibiting and looking at controlling exports of IP and technology that will not put us in position of essentially funding the whether it's the Chinese surveillance state, Chinese kind of techno-authoritarianism, or simply the military capabilities that will threaten us and our partners throughout the world. And particularly with this new set of technologies that we're seeing, machine learning and AI, the line between what is civilian use and military use is very narrow, whether there's a line or blurry, and there may not be a line at all. So we make a series of recommendations in our report about reevaluating our export control system, about looking at how our CFIUS system, which regulates investment in the United States, how that should be matched up in this new technological competition with China? How should that be reformed? How do we deal with this, not just dual use issue, but essentially no distinction at all between civilian technologies and military technologies?
I think that's a super important topic area that we've got to work really, really hard on. And I trust that everyone on the Hill is going to want a lot of help on digging deep into this. I've dealt with a lot of governors who are trying to help their constituents understand who they're doing business with, where money is coming from. There's talk about trying to replicate the federal CFIUS process to adapt to state conditions. And whether that is the right way, wrong way, I think it's a definite acknowledgement that really from the ground up, we need to rethink these things and figure out where there's information sharing, where there's ways to collaborate federal and state and among the states, because the challenge is too big for one entity based out of DC to be able to deal with it. But one of the broad principal areas that I've tried to address in the podcast and in general that I think may help us on the economic and security area, maybe imperfect though it is the ideal of reciprocity. And in some ways helps save us and our entities from themselves, in that the Communist Party of China has chosen to decouple from the United States and the international system in important ways. And they don't allow us to buy land in their country. They don't allow us access into sensitive research programs in their universities, or even the gray zone, as you accurately point out. It's not like it's blue and red. It's purple in China in terms of party, state, and education and what have you. It's all one blur in some ways. But is there something to how this ideal of reciprocity, I think, naturally hits Americans in basic fairness or what have you, that what the CCP does not allow us to do there, we should not be really allowing them that privilege here. I've heard arguments for or against, but I still think it's a very useful framing principle. And maybe it should be cautionary that if they're not allowing us to do these things in their country, maybe there's something going on they don't want us to see.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting because, again, we have supported reciprocity over the decades that I have been doing this. I have been shocked to see how long it took before the concept of reciprocity fit into the bigger policy framework about what was taking place. It should have been there right from the beginning. If they can, as you said, if they can do things here and we can't do them there, there's something wrong. There needs to be some openness. And a perfect example of that, going back to, again, sorry, taking this back a little bit, but in the 1990s, when we were talking about some of the trade restrictions, most favored nation status, people would keep saying to us, oh, well, that's protectionist. And they would raise the specter of Smoot-Hawley tariffs. And I would be saying, but the Chinese economy, I mean, they're protectionist. They have fenced off parts of their economy. We have seen that more recently. They have fenced off parts of the economy, not just for their quote unquote national security reasons, but for the economic growth. So e-commerce, they did not allow American companies in to do e-commerce until Chinese companies had gotten so big and so strong that our companies don't have a chance to compete. And they have done that with issue after issue after issue. So everybody needs to wake up and recognize that this is the thing that has been going on for a while, and we really need to address it.
I agree. Alex, how does it strike you?
Yeah, I'd like to highlight that reciprocity is not a new concept. I mean, it's the one should be at the heart of the WTO. And going back to the Commission's report last year, our top recommendation was to review China's compliance with those reciprocal tenets, as well as its agreement with the United States when we voted to grant them permanent normal trade relations. And we knew that study would reveal that they were not being reciprocal, that they were not abiding by the agreements that they had made in the world trading system with its decades now of subsidies and currency manipulation and other measures to create an uneven trading playing field with the United States. And our recommendation was to give the power to rescind that that status. But I want to highlight too here that this is a very conscious and very open and blatant strategy by China. Many of your listeners will have heard the term dual circulation adopted by Xi Jinping. That is explicitly an attempt to insulate China from any dependencies on the world while deepening dependencies of the world on China. And they're doing that for strategic leverage reasons. So they are anti-reciprocity. And we have to recognize that and, again, formulate a proper response.
I agree 1,000% on that. It's one of those concepts I hope it doesn't take another 30 years for everyone to kind of grasp and see, this is pretty obvious. And to your point, Carolyn, they're not actually hiding it. They're very transparent that this is what they're doing. So if we take a step as we're getting near the end of our conversation, take a step back. We'll have the report come out. We've been grappling with a lot of these big pieces for a long time. I feel like our country is at a very different place now than when the commission started. I think that China is definitely in a very different place, and the world is too. There's some of our broad policies in U.S.-China relations that have changed over the arc of those couple of decades. But at least to my sensibilities, not that many big policies have changed very much. So I'm very curious about where you see maybe there's some light at the end of this tunnel. Here we are going through the perennial political season. And Congress, where you work and serve, has a lot of people who practice politics, and yet they're policymakers too. Do we have the magic of the China set of issues and the Hill having been a check and a balance on the executive branch of Republicans and Democrat administrations over the years? Do we have an opportunity to actually move forward in a big policy issue or two in 2024, regardless of where the broader political campaigns go? Carolyn, you want to take the first swing at that one?
Yes. Well, I hope that people take the opportunity. What I am always concerned about in a political environment, a campaign environment, is maintaining the bipartisanship that will allow the issues to move forward. So I hope that they do. I think one of the things, Steve, that has changed again over these years, I would say this one is probably over the course of the past 10 years, is the business community, right? I'm really grossly overgeneralizing, but a lot of times the business community is like, well, we can't not be in that market, and we're producing there, and blah 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 blah. And I think that having gone through intellectual property theft and having their some of their people arrested most recently, that there's a lot of question now on the part of U.S. companies and multinational companies about what kind of risk do they have of being in China. And so that has changed the debate some too, right? You don't just have people who come in and say, well, we can't do anything to upset them because otherwise they're going to have an impact on our economic relations.
What did we hear that a lot?
Oh my gosh. We heard it, I think, going through the 1990s. We can't do X to upset, we can't do human rights pressure to upset them because we need them on North Korea, on drugs, on this, on that, and the other. And then, of course, we didn't get the cooperation on all of those things. But at one point, I thought the only thing I have not heard is we can't upset the Chinese government because we need their cooperation on the arts. I think that was the only thing that was not invoked. So yes, I'm hopeful that we actually can get some progress on some of these things. The Biden administration is moving forward on some things. The Trump administration moved forward on some things. So I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful about that. Alex?
Yeah, I want to echo something that Carolyn said. I think for many of us, U.S. policy never moves as fast as we would like. But just looking back to the tenor of the conversation on U.S.-China policy that existed 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, I think there was a strong debate at those times between, quote unquote, engagement and quote unquote competition. I think that debate is largely settled now. And the tenor of the conversation, as I think we touched on earlier in this call, the tenor of the conversation in DC is very much focused not on whether we should compete or how we should contend with the China challenge, or whether we should contend with the China challenge, but how do we do it? And I think part of our report is about how Europe is reacting to the China challenge. And We were in Brussels for a trip as a part of our research for our report, talking to our European counterparts. And when I talked to these same Europeans when I was in the Trump administration, there has been a sea change in how they view China. Now, you can chalk that up to COVID. I think COVID was a huge factor in changing people's views on China. I think the incursions in and around Taiwan has helped that, and the crackdown in Hong Kong has helped that. All of these have accumulated in recent years, I think, to change the tenor of the conversation. But we have not yet seen, in my view, the strong muscle movements in military spending, economic realignment and resiliency, and kind of political information, rising to the political information warfare that we're seeing. I think those muscle movements will hopefully come, but as you're saying, Steve, and as I think Carolyn is saying, it does take leadership, presidential leadership and congressional leadership, and I'm hopeful that we'll see that in the coming years.
Well, I want to thank you both, and I'm going to wind up this episode of the podcast a little differently than I have in previous episodes, and hopefully the audience will appreciate and indulge. But one of the areas where the commission has done specific work is near and dear to my heart and my family now, and it has to do with the scourge of fentanyl. That is I think, a unique attack on American families and communities. And it is one that is willfully exported out of the world's most advanced surveillance state. So they cannot say they do not know. We in the United States, and I know there's been fine work by the research staff of the commission and elsewhere, know that the precursors of fentanyl are coming from China in collaboration with cartels into our country. It's sadly getting laced into products that people are taking, thinking that they're going to deal with their ADHD or their anxiety or something else. And it is literally killing Americans. And if it was just the drug using community that was affected, that would be one thing. It is also destroying the finances of families, the fabric of families, the ripple effects of living with an addict or someone who has been sadly taken from us by way of a lethal dose of fentanyl is, I think, a weapon of mass destruction against the American family. And if there's one area where I hope in 2024 that Republicans and Democrats on the Hill and elsewhere, together with governors across this country, can find a way to be forthright, serious of purpose, it's to protect our children and our families from this scourge. Our audience doesn't know yet, but now they do know that my daughter was lost just a few weeks ago to this very thing. It is a blood oath from me that we are going to work and cooperate with anyone, regardless of politics, regardless of station in life, to uphold those who are suffering to deal with this, that they don't stand alone. But you can bet your bottom dollar that any outside entity that is responsible for doing this is got to be held to account. And any entity that's doing business with them needs to feel the heat, the rage, and the pain of American families that have suffered from this. They are in number greater than the victims of 9/11. Well, I don't minimize those, and I had my entire life changed from that. It is greater than those affected by COVID, and many of us have experiences there. I think this is fundamental. It hits us where it hurts the most, and I wish that my family's experience was isolated. Sadly, it's not. It's in every state, rural, urban, otherwise, Republican or Democrat. There's no ethnic group that is untouched by this. So I hope that in addition to your report and the great work that you do on the commission, I would just spike the football on this fentanyl issue as one that is cross-cutting in many, many different ways. And regardless of who the evildoers are in the middle of the supply chain, we know where it's coming from. And our top leaders in every arm of American government have got to hold the Chinese leadership feet to the fire on this. And that's my humble editorial at the end of today's episode. But I want to thank both Carolyn and Alex for a wonderful conversation. I apologize to each of them because in some ways we probably cut short. They're both deep in expertise on a lot of different issues. And the report that is forthcoming is going to cover way more than we could, even in this episode. So I'd encourage our audience to find the report. But with that, Carolyn, do you want to tell our audience where they should go to track the forthcoming report?
Yes, uscc.gov. Everything, our hearing records are up there, and the report will be on there as of, I believe, on Tuesday. It's big, as you say. Also, you can contact the commission directly and get hard copies. We've had some hard copies printed. We have an executive summary, what we call the glossy version, which I think of as the Cliff Notes version of it, which I think is only 40 pages as opposed to, 400 or something like that. So yes, uscc.gov. We also have a Twitter feed, but the best way to get to the report is on our website. Thank you, Steve. Thank you very much. My condolences on the loss of your daughter, but thank you. And we look forward to working with you on these issues.
Very good. Alex, anything you want to put out on socials, people to follow your expert analysis?
Well, just to put out the China Commission Twitter account handle, it is at USCC_gov if folks want to follow that. And that's particularly useful when we have hearings. You could follow the commentary on the hearings. But I did want to add my voice to the condolences, Steve. And particularly on the fentanyl issue, if I can add something to that. My wife's a prosecutor. And so she's fighting on the front lines to fight drug traffickers here in Washington, D.C. But to really fight a war, you have to get at the long supply lines, not just the front lines, the long supply lines. And as you're saying, they lead right back to China. And, the Communist Party has shown an ability to shut off fentanyl trade before when it's made a high enough priority, when there's enough pressure placed upon them. I saw that when I was in the Trump administration. But when they're pressed now, what they say is, well, this is made by a lot of criminals and it's hard for us to track. It's hard for us to enforce at a local level. We're talking about an authoritarian government that surveils its population and can reach down to the individual citizen of their country. They can crack down on this if they wanted to. They can crack down on this if they felt it was a high enough priority and there was enough threat. So this has to be a policy issue. Again, going back to the presidential level, to looking at the scale of this disaster on our society, we have to view this as the most insidious form of chemical warfare on our country, and that's the priority that we have to place on this. So, Steve, I support you in the energy that you feel behind this and how deeply you feel about it. But again, my condolences.
Thank you, Alex, and to Carolyn. And I would just punctuate that a government that can micromanage shared images of Winnie the Pooh certainly can find chemical precursors.
Yes.
But to our audience, if you have enjoyed today's China Desk conversation, please tell your friends and consider subscribing on YouTube or your preferred podcast platform. Thank you for joining, and a special thank you to Carolyn Bartholomew and Alex Wong for sharing their perspectives. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.